A couple of things happened in the weeks following Annika's death. The first was that the news of her death spread faster than the fire I'd set to her house. We didn't have many murders here, and people were buzzing. The hills were alive with the sound of people gossiping about her tragic death. The second thing was that the day after she died, 2 deputies showed up on my front porch. Deputy Calloway and Deputy Markinson. I knew Nicholas Markinson, not personally, but I knew of him. His father used to be the sheriff, and before that, his grandfather was the sheriff. His father, Mark Markinson, and I'm not even shitting you, that was his actual goddamn name. But when his father died, Mark Markinson was basically handed the badge and office, and everyone pretty much crossed their fingers and hoped for the best. He had been fired about 3 years ago when he was caught smuggling drugs. This wasn't the official story, however, but we all knew. One look at Mark Markinson, and you could tell the man had heroin and who knows how many other drugs coursing through his veins. Mark Markinson was deteriorating faster than the speed of light, and he was one snort away from the heaven doors, or hell's gates. I don't think God would allow someone like Mark Markinson in heaven, not because of all of his sins or whatnot, but Mark Markinson? That name was a complete fucking joke. Anyway, the deputies came over and I let them in. Markinson shook my hand and took a seat on my couch without waiting for me to offer him a seat. I sat down across from him. Calloway remained standing. "Did you know a woman named Lola Annika Monnier?" he asked me. I pretended to think for a while before I answered. "I knew a woman named Annika. Her last name wasn't Monnier though," I replied. Calloway shifted his weight from one foot to another, and Markinson leaned back on my couch. "Annika Jones?" He nodded. "She was using a fake identity and your father's last name." "I didn't know that," I replied. "How did you know Miss Jones?" Calloway asked. "She was my mother's ex-wife," I replied. "The one who stole her money?" Markinson asked. I nodded, remembering how they had done close to nothing in attempt to track her down. "When was the last time you saw her?" Calloway asked. I pretended to think again. "Gosh, I don't know. A few months? Not since she ran off with all the money," I said. "Landon, Annika is dead," Markinson said. "What?" I asked, pretending to be shocked. All of this pretending was making me hungry. "Someone killed her and burned down half of her house," Calloway said. "Someone? You don't know who?" I asked. I could tell from their faces that they didn't suspect me. They were really just here to ask questions, and after a few more that they were pretty unnecessary, they left. Thirdly, about 2 days after their visit, I got lucky. Turns out, some stupid high school kid had set fire to an abandoned warehouse and then set a trash can on fire, along with a cat, and put it on the front porch of some old woman who lived up where Annika's house was. When they were searched, they found gasoline in all of their cars and they were being investigated. So I guess I got lucky. So thank God. Or Satan, I guess. I don't think God would help me get away with murder. I made a list of people who I thought needed to die. Not on paper or anything, of course. I wasn't that stupid. I just made a mental note of all the people who I thought should die. I also figured that I should probably stop killing people that I had connections to for a while. So instead, I decided to go after Mark Markinson. Seeing his son had brought up just how stupid his name was and all the things he did as a cop. So I went after him and he was my next victim. Like I mentioned before, addicts are pretty easy targets. No one will really look twice if a heroin addict overdoses. Same with prostitutes. Most people don't want to investigate the death of someone who gets paid for sex and works street corners. They don't care about prostitutes unless they're using them. That's a whole different story. I found Mark Markinson in an abandoned building on the bad side of town, where all the druggies gathered to trip on LSD and shoot themselves up with heroin. I pulled my hat further down to hide my face and fixed the ridiculous wig I had purchased, then made sure I put my gloves on before stepping into that place. He looked and smelled like shit, and he was out cold when I found him, with no one else around to see me drag him into my car and drive a few miles up the road into a secluded house in the same drug-infested neighborhood. The people who stayed around here were drugged out of their minds, so the streets were pretty empty. Even the police were afraid to patrol this area and only did it about twice a week, and this day was not one of those two. So I parked behind the house in the alley, dragged him into the house, sat Mark Markinson on a chair, and waited for him to wake the hell up. I waited 45 minutes for the man to wake up. When he did, he didn't even freak out. He looked around his surroundings and laughed. "How the hell did I get to the trip house?" He laughed. I watched him try to stand up and fail. He looked up at me, and his face twisted into confusion. "If you're looking for drugs, I'm not selling any, boy. You need to go find Charlie for that." I leaned against the wall. "I'm not looking for drugs," I replied. "And what the hell do you want? You ain't no druggie," Mark Markinson mumbled. "Well, I just want to kill you," I replied, stepping closer. This did almost nothing to capture his attention. The man merely shrugged. "Oh yeah? Why's that?" he asked. "Lois Calvert," I replied. Mark Markinson's head rolled over to one side. "Boy, you're talking crazy. I don't know no goddamn Lois," he said. I walked closer to him. "Oh, so I'm guessing that you didn't ask for her name before you raped her then?" I asked. Marky Boy laughed, or attempted to. "I ain't never raped anyone." "Oh really?" 4 years ago, she was walking home from school. It was only 5 in the afternoon, but it was wintertime, so it was pretty dark out. You offered her a ride, but you raped her inside of your car in an alley. Told her that if she reported it, you would lock up her dad for smuggling drugs," I replied. Markinson pushed himself up a bit. "Yeah, that pretty little blonde girl. I ain't rape her though. She wanted it," he mumbled, half smiling. "She was 12, I replied. "Yeah, well, she looked 21 to me," Mark Markinson mumbled. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small bag of crystal rock and tossed it to Mark. It landed on his lap. "What's this for?" he asked. "For you, on the house," I replied. Mark took off his shoe and used it to further crush up the contents of the bag, then spilled the contents on the floor and pulled some kind of card from his pocket. Then I watched him snort the entire thing. I left after that, pulled my car out of the alley, and drove down the street and around town for a bit. I took a stroll in the park, ate a burger. I even went and visited my father. The next day, the talk of the town was that Mark Markinson, the old sheriff, had been found dead in a drug house. Apparently one of his buddies found him and thought he walked into a murder scene because of how beat up Mark was. Turns out he was wrong. It wasn't a murder. The old sheriff had taken Flocka, or the zombie drug, as they refer to it. It apparently makes you do crazy things like throw yourself against walls and beat yourself to death. Isn't that tragic?